Everyone could take their seats so we can take attendance and make sure that everyone's here. Let me begin with a brief couple of statements as a setup for our extraordinarily distinguished panel. It goes probably without saying that the internet by its nature is international and it's about the future. Our panel for the next hour or so is going to focus on those two pieces, the international, transborder aspects of the internet, and the future. We've experienced, I think, over the past year or so, some extraordinary developments, many of which have been the focus of previous discussions here last year at TPI and in previous conferences, about the transformational power of the internet economically and the extraordinary and transformational aspects of the internet and the free flow of information politically. During the past year, we've seen a tremendous set of changes, not only economically, as Professor Jorgensen indicated, and as he's projected for the future, but also obviously with the Arab Spring, continuing issues about China and the free flow of information there, the number and variety of cyber attacks and the impact that that's been having on economies and people's views about the role of technology in their lives, the issues that we were just talking about in the previous panel or so about privacy and the impact that has on people's feelings about technology and the like. We've seen, I think, not only an explosive growth around the world in terms of freedom, democracy, and economic activity because of the internet, but we've also seen a tremendous flattening of the use of technology internationally, where, as we started to gather at these sorts of meetings around the year 2000 or so, it was really a discussion about the role of technology in the internet in the United States, Europe, and a few other places. Nothing has changed more dramatically in the past decade than the diffusion of technology, and particularly the internet and wireless, around the world. Just a few statistics from the International Telecommunications Union, which just issued some numbers from 2010, which are obviously already out of date, but I think give some indication about what we're talking about here. Back in the year 2000, the global penetration for fixed phones was about 16% after about 100 years. Mobile phones, which of course have been growing so rapidly during the 80s and 90s, was about 12% globally. Today, about a decade after those 2000 numbers, global internet penetration is 30%. About 1 in 3 people in the world, no matter where they live, have access and use of the internet. An extraordinary change. Similarly, what you see in various regions reflect this. Internet user penetration in Africa grew 20-fold in the past decade, from less than 1%, 0.5%, to over 10, almost 11%. And obviously in the past year or so, with the growth of mobile-based internet, that number is substantially higher. Mobile cellular penetration in Africa in 2010 was about over 45%. That number is higher than mobile cellular penetration in the Americas just in 2004. Africa has more cellular penetration than we had in the Americas just about 6 or 7 years ago. In the Americas, penetration for mobile phones is now about 95% as of last year, and clearly has grown. So virtually everyone in the Americas is using and has access to mobile phones. With that as background, and the understanding about the great progress that's been made, it's clear that it's not all good news. Obviously, as we've heard from the previous panels, there's tremendous international discussion about where things are going and what the appropriate role of government and industry and civil society is as we discuss these matters and we try to promote greater economic freedom and greater political freedom. We have treaties that will be negotiated over the next year or so at the International Telecommunications Union that will go to the very basic question of who gets to regulate the internet. We have those ongoing discussions in a variety of other forums. The role and importance of government, the role and relative importance of industry and civil society has never been more hotly debated, and the stakes have never been greater. Commissioner McDowell gave a speech in June in Sweden in which he talked about the importance of the internet, free flow of information, and the like. And Commissioner, if I could ask you at the end of that speech, that extraordinary speech, you said, freedom-loving governments everywhere should resist the temptation to regulate in the absence of persuasive market failure. Now, you heard this morning a lot of discussion about the role of government. You've heard questions about the role of government. Is your position that there is no appropriate role for government absent some persuasive market failure? Or is there some facilitating role for government? And in particular for the FCC, what should be done?
Well, first of all, David, many thanks to TPI for having me here. It's a gorgeous day outside, for those of you who haven't been able to peek outside. And I know that we're all that's standing between you and lunch outside. So, and by my look at the watch, the panel's already 3/4 over according to the schedule. So I'll try to be succinct. Also, let me just apologize up front. I've been in Wyoming for the past week with my family, where my toughest decisions have been what trail to take with my horse. So the brain has gone to mush a little bit. I'll try to get it back in shape here for purposes of this panel. And also, David, many thanks for the kind words on the speech I gave in Stockholm. Of course, you were the inspiration for that, a speech you gave, I think, in 2007. And of course, I expanded upon some of those themes and updated them, et cetera. Certainly, government can help facilitate, but the concern that I tried to convey in that speech and over the years that I've been at the FCC is that we have a bit of a one-way ratchet when it comes to regulation in the internet space. So you just said something which I jotted down, which I thought was telling, and I don't know if you deliberately chose these words or if it was a bit of a Freudian slip or what, but you said we're about to enter this phase where we're going to be negotiating international treaties, and the question to be answered will be who gets to regulate the internet, okay? So 10 years ago, the question was whether the internet should be regulated at all. So if you think of the one-way ratchet I just described, that is the big concern, that it's a race to the bottom of the lowest common denominator, with the lowest common denominator being the maximum amount of regulation. So as one country may try to regulate one component or all components of the internet, maybe with the best of intentions, that gives more nefarious states really the cover that they are desiring to do the same thing, but for less pure motives, shall we say. So that is at the root of my concern. And so I'm very concerned that that's where we're headed internationally. But the good news is, as I also said in that speech, is that at the end of the day, the way that the internet is designed, the architecture of it defies top-down authoritarian control, be that technical control or political control. And if you look at Egypt, and then I'll be quiet because I know we have a lot of other panelists to hear from, but if we look at what happened in Egypt just earlier this year, attempts to shut off the internet, the alleged kill switch by the government when you had more government control of networks, and there were workarounds. So whether they were primitive workarounds such as dial-up or using satellite to bounce into other countries, or just outright defiance. Mysteriously, some ISPs never did shut down. The internet in Egypt was down, actually technically perhaps never, but it certainly wasn't down in a wholesale way for more than about a week. So governments can try to design the internet of their their dreams to preserve their own political fortunes. But I think they are doomed in the long run, and I think China is another good example of that. And I'll stop there, and we can talk about China later, perhaps.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Iñaki, Telefonica is active not only in Europe, but particularly in the Americas, with extraordinary systems throughout much of the Americas. When we've talked about the internet, when we've talked about technology here in the United States, we often think, first of all, about ourselves, second, a bit about Europe, third, about the Middle East because of the use of technology for the Arab Spring, and a bit about China and so forth. Often what's lost is discussion about Latin America. I gave you a couple of statistics about the tremendous growth in Latin America. As you hear the discussion we've had this morning about the role of government, the issues that are presented, how do you see in Latin America, but the Americas generally, the growth of internet and the impact that that's having?
Thank you, David, for the questions. As a Pan-American operator, the last 20 years operating in the Latin American countries, in 13 different countries, we have seen that one society has access to ICT, and people adopt technology in a very high speed and in a very creative ways, I must say. In this sense, investment across Latin America is on the rise, driving down prices, and expanding the ICT in a higher levels. Completely agree with your figure, but I would like to, according with Pyramid Research, the penetration rate in 2010 in Latin America reached 100% penetration in mobile phones. That's we can see that the mobile platform will be the main way in Latin America to connect to internet. Latin America in particular is the most dynamic society online. We have 200 million users, is around 35% of the population. And we see that with a 15 annual growth of internet compared with the 8% worldwide. That's one of another key figure that I want to share with you. But one is most important is 92% of these 200 million population users of internet, they're using for the social media, compared with the 86% worldwide. We just see that the Latin American population is the most powerful engine for change, and this is a trend that we feel will continue in the future, demanding an increase of broadband services, and for a company like ours, more investment not only in infrastructure, even in the innovative services.
Do you find that this is being driven primarily by wireless? Is that how people in most of America? And if so, how are the regulatory aspects? Is there enough spectrum? What are the issues for you all as you look at the growth?
In the regulatory arena, I think that the best situation for the key policy tools that our point of view is that the vital role of the policymakers to promote a forward-looking regulatory environment that stimulates the innovation, for example. The key policy tools allows in ICT to flourish is creating established investment-friendly climate for investment, for business, promoting a value services such e-government or e-health in terms of when the government can play the crucial role, and ensuring that ICT and the skills required to be used reach and serve areas and populations. That would be great for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, your focus has been a lot on cyber issues generally, but including cybersecurity. We've heard this morning, of course, everyone's been very focused for quite a while on what is the appropriate role of government, what's the appropriate role of companies, what's the role of civil society in trying to create a safer environment online. General Hayden, who used to be the director of both the CIA and NSA, was in Aspen not too long ago and suggested that there should be some fundamental relooking at those relationships, including the issue of, as he referred to it, self-defense, and sort of gave the impression, at least, that perhaps that companies should be allowed to be more active in defending their networks, including the use of mercenary types of activities, and Blackwater was often referred to. What's going on here? Is there really an opportunity for companies to operate internationally in ways to defend their networks in ways that don't have to be sensitive to governmental controls?
Well, I'll take, as a recovering lawyer, I'll use the thing that the lawyers are so good at, which is taking the question and answering a different question. I mean, I would say this, that for a long time, one of the dangers of having any individuals or companies doing a self-help mechanism and going back and trying to strike back at the people who are attacking them is that you could be wrong in terms of attribution. You could have substantial sovereignty effects when you go through other nations. You could have collateral damages. There are a whole lot of reasons why that is a difficult way to do this. But that doesn't mean that there's not a huge role for companies and for all the other actors you talk about. And I'd like to key off something Danny said in the last panel. I think we are at an inflection point in a lot of the things that are happening in terms of internet policy right now. And literally, every international organization, every important bilateral relationship, cyber issues, cybersecurity included, but the full panoply of cyber issues is becoming much more on the front burner. And decisions are being made which are going to determine what the future of this technology is. And I think we need to do a far better job, and not just we in the government, but we in the government working with the private sector. And I'm not naive. The private sector is not some monolithic thing. It is a range of different interests, and with NGOs in a way that's really a multi-stakeholder approach to approach it. So what that's been grounded on, and this is where the private sector does play a very large role. The administration issued an international strategy for cyberspace, the first time any administration has done something like this, recognizing how important the international environment is right now, and that if we are going to actually shape the future of this technology and continue to have real impact, we have to have a mission statement. We have to say what we're about, and that's an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable information and communications infrastructure that gives voice to protection of fundamental values like free speech, but it also looks at cybersecurity, cybercrime, internet governance issues, and even the military aspects, because they all hang together. And the private sector features very prominently throughout that whole thread. Also, my new position was created by Secretary Clinton in the State Department to bring all these issues together so we have a much more coherent foreign policy, and to create something that's new called international cyber diplomacy. Really elevating this beyond the. As you well know, often this is discussed in very technical forums and niche forums, not seen to be a major foreign policy issue, but that has changed. And I think because of the way this technology impacts all of us, it has to be a major foreign policy issue in all these forums and all of our important relationships, and that's changing. I was just in Aspen a couple of weeks ago where the Aspen strategy group at a very high level of national security folks and former national security folks was thinking about these issues, which is something that just wouldn't have happened a couple of years ago. And you also have to bring these different communities together. One of the frustrations I think I've seen over the last few years, and Danny can attest to this too, is that you have all these different really good things happening in different silos within the government and also outside the government. You have the people looking at governance issues, you have the people looking at security issues, you have the people looking at internet freedom issues, and we need to bring those groups together, because you're not going to really have solutions to some of the things you talked about in the beginning if we don't do that. And just one mention on one of the things we need to do developing with the rest of the world. You mentioned Africa, and you mentioned obviously Latin America. I don't think we've done as good a job as we need to engage the G77 countries in the developing world. We recently did a East African training conference with 5 of the East African countries in Nairobi. I think that was very successful. We are reaching out more and more because of things like the ITU and WICIT, where each of these countries are going to have a voice, and we really have to, I think, reach and approach them. So back on Hayden's comments, I agree. The threat is out there. It's a serious threat. There's lots of ways to look at it. We do have to engage the private sector in doing that, but we have to do it in a method that also looks at what our goals are and our policies are.
Now, you talked about the foreign policy aspects. Obviously, one of the places where this is being actively discussed is at the United Nations itself, the ultimate international political body, which frightens, I think, a lot of people, including many in this room, as a place for decisions and discussions about technology issues, and at the ITU, where we have treaty negotiations that will go to the question of what the jurisdiction of the ITU over issues such as cybersecurity. Where is the administration on where these discussions should take place?
So I don't think you have discussions in just one forum. There are too many different issues being debated to have them just one place. But I'll give you a recent example of something I think was a real success. The U.S., I think, really took a large role in working with the OECD to come up with internet policy-making principles, which emphasized transparency, emphasized the multi-stakeholder nature of this. They were developed with the private sector and NGOs there as well, talked about security, talked about crime, really tried to hit that battlefront. Now, those are about 34 countries, but that's an important group to start moving these norms that we talked about in the international strategy forward. The ITU has done very good work in capacity building, and that's something where I think the skills match what need to be done. As an organization that has a more top-down approach, that wants to get involved in more internet governance, I think the models we have now are working. We need to strengthen those models. We need to make those more transparent and more accountable, but that's being done. So I think, you don't necessarily need one ring to rule them all in this. I think, in fact, that's a mistake in this area because there are so many different issues, and we really are trying to really think about issues that are threshold issues right now. So jumping right to, for instance, as often been discussed, some global treaty is not really where we need to be. We need to discuss these norms. We need to discuss what the rules of the road are. There is a conference coming up in the UK. Foreign Minister Hague is having a conference in November to discuss this full range of issues, and it will invite, I think, something like over 60 countries, NGOs, and the private sector. I think we have to have more discussions like that, and there is a role for all these other international organizations, and we just have to figure out what is the right role given their expertise and experience.
Well, speaking about roles, Bob, companies such as yours have obviously been greatly benefited by technology and have been a real source of political dialogue, discussions about freedom, free flow of information, and the like. A lot of the discussions during the Arab Spring focused on companies such as yours and others about the importance of access to information. On the other hand, you're often, and other high-tech companies are often blamed when things go wrong for what it is you did or did not do. Tell me a little bit about where your thinking has evolved and what you're thinking about now about the role of large multinational companies in terms of both the relationship to governments, but also in terms of how they can facilitate the march towards freedom as well as the economic development around the world.
Well, there's a simple question.
That's what I specialize in, simple questions.
I guess I want to start by taking exception with the title for our panel, which I think is something like the internet in a post-Wikileaks, post-Egypt world, because I think both Wikileaks and Egypt are still going on and going on strong. And that it's a really important thing for us to think of the changes that are going on as a long process. And if you look particularly at Egypt and the role of the internet, which people said was so important, and that it was going to drive massive change, and you look today at what's happening in Egypt, you have to kind of raise your eyebrows and say, well, perhaps it wasn't the great magic silver bullet that people thought it would be. In terms of what companies have to do or should be doing, I guess the first thing I'll say is that no company should tell another company what to do. This is something that we believe and have believed all along, particularly with regard to our China experience. Those people who follow the China story will remember back when we announced a couple of years ago that we had had an attack on our infrastructure there, and that 30 other companies had also been attacked. by what we assumed and what we could prove was somewhere in China, by a group somewhere in China. But we did not publicize the names of the other companies. We shared the information with those companies because we felt it was the right thing to do, but simply because it was our decision to come out publicly, we did not want to make that a decision for others. A second thing that I would say is that our company, and again, I don't speak for others, is not in the business of regime change. Did you all get that? Despite what you might have associated with our now on leave, I'll repeat, on leave staffer, Wael Gonim in Egypt, that's not what we exist to do. We really have two major principles that we follow when it comes to how Google should be involved in political change. And the first is a default position that we follow, which is to let information flow. That our job is to be a platform for people who want to express themselves rather than an instrument of political change. If it leads to political change, if we maximize opportunities for people to express themselves, to access information, all the better. But we don't want to serve, again, as an instrument. When I say that that's our default position, and this is something we can discuss at some length, there is no cookie cutter that you can apply to that policy or that principle of letting information flow. Different cultural and historical contexts govern our decisions from Thailand to Turkey. Let me also point out a second principle which we have, which is transparency. We believe that as a company, it's our responsibility to be as transparent as is possible under the law about what is going on around the world with our services. And I would recommend that those of you who haven't seen it, take a look at the Google Transparency Report, which actually shows you in real time which of our services are blocked where, and we are trying to make that more and more specific so you can see how long they're blocked for, and perhaps a guess at why. Is it a mechanical problem, or is it a block imposed by a government? A second thing that we do there is we show you which URLs and sites you can't get hold of in certain places. I guess that if I had advice to give to companies, I would say pretty simply that reputation is a killer app. And that's something that I think that companies are experiencing more and more as information increases and you look around the world at what happens to those companies that put themselves in a position that they ought not be in with their users and with, in particular, Western governments. It's easy to get in trouble, and maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Well, let me follow up just a little bit on that. How are things going with GNI, speaking about reputations and so forth, and where do you see that going forward?
GNI stands for the Global Network Initiative. If you can believe this, for 2 years, representatives of human rights groups, companies, socially responsible investors such as Domini and Calvert, and academics all gathered in a conference room. Yes, for 2 years we did this every month, to negotiate out a set of principles and guidelines for how IT companies should behave in dealing with governments on the questions of the promotion of the freedom of expression and also threats to their users' privacy. GNI, I think, has advanced a long way since it was launched about a year and a half ago. We have people in place who are doing work every day, which is a big difference from when you just have the members of that group sitting around criticizing each other. Not that you would ever criticize another person in a group. Our number one need is to recruit more companies, particularly companies that are based in Europe, and we're working very hard on that because it should be the global network initiative, and currently the only members that are companies are Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo. Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo aren't exactly small companies and do have operations around the world. But I think that the whole effort itself would be strengthened greatly by the addition of other companies.
Thank you. Brian, one of the things that we've been talking about throughout this morning has been the issue of international cooperation. There's obviously a lot of tensions that come out of that, a lot of opportunities that come out of that. As people have been thinking about this upcoming year, I think they see a lot of potential storm clouds on that horizon of international cooperation. Just to throw out a few, ICANN, for example, is going to go through a major change. Rod Beckstrom has announced that he's leaving, so he'll be gone no later than, I assume, than next July. That will have a major impact. ICANN itself has been a bit in turmoil. Its relationship to governments, to the GAC, has been a source of great frustration from some and views about where governments will go because of that frustration. As we've already talked a little bit about, we have an ITU treaty to be negotiated, and there's no secret that many governments would like to see the ITU take a more active role with regard to some of the things that ICANN and others have done in the domain space. Where are we going this upcoming year? And I should also mention, of course, as we were talking about a little bit before, you have intellectual property related issues coming to the fore and how this whole mix, which we haven't really spoken a lot about this morning, but are extraordinarily important. You have our customs now shutting down some domains because of concern about intellectual property, and at least one court has upheld that going forward. Where are we going with this, and where do you see all this playing out?
Storm clouds indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you. I work primarily for .org, for the Public Interest Registry, and spend a lot of my time working on ICANN issues. So thank you for the framing with respect to ICANN issues, and I'll speak to that, David. But we are a global operator. We operate .org in every country of the world. We're a registry operator, so we have to resolve those domain names on the internet. They have to be universally resolvable, interoperable, and that's our core mission and responsibility. But I do see storm clouds, David. You look at, and I'll embrace for a moment the title of the panel, which is post-WikiLeaks and post-Egypt. If you look at WikiLeaks, if you look at the Egypt experience, if you look at ICANN's approval of the .xxx domain, if you look at the takedown order of Roja Directa of the .com and .org sites, and the Spanish site staying up in a debate between what's legal and illegal between the US and Spain, what I see is just a growing evidence of serious government angst. Angst about how to address criminal acts or what they view as bad acts on the internet. And it comes back to the fact that the decentralized, interoperable architecture of the internet makes that task very difficult. So these are stressors in the system. And my view at Public Interest Registry is really the opportunity, and the challenge right now sits at the lap of the industry. I have a cartoon. Could you put that up, Mark? So this is something that was just whipped up this morning. It's the first pass, but in trying to give a sense of the environment right now, it feels like we're the Dutch boy with the holes in the dike. And we have industry as one of the, I guess, Dutch men, that's not really a boy, trying to plug up the hole with respect to DNS filtering. And you see the Egypt takedown as being another worry. And on down the wall a bit, you've got government who's trying to, plug up the hole for WikiLeaks, and you've got Roja Direct up there and .xxx. And the challenge that I see is that this isn't being done in a coordinated fashion. It's not being done with a common understanding. And another good example is the Protect IP bill, which I think was has been a very useful exercise in how to engage between industry and government. There was a technical white paper issued by a number of very bright lights from the technical community who talked about how the provisions of the Protect IP bill, and the motivations of which we don't quarrel with, but how they could impact the operation of the DNS itself, how it could impact the operation of DNSSEC, okay, the security protocol. This is the core issue, and this is the core engagement. The architecture of the internet is the secret sauce. If we're going to continue to have global expansion of the internet, if we're going to continue to have the benefits that the internet bring, along with the challenges, That's where the core engagement has to happen. And if you look back at ICANN's charter, and ICANN is not the be-all and end-all of internet governance, the discussion is much broader, but that was chartered to be a private sector-led multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. To my mind, the challenge is at the feet of industry now to step up in a more meaningful way, in a more mature way in some instances, and ICANN's example with that process with the GAC has unfortunately cast light on some insufficiencies in that relationship. But the challenges to industry right now, and the problem, and, hearing from Chris and hearing from Bob, I couldn't agree more. We're not monolithic. Industry's not monolithic. Registry operators and registrars huddle in ICANN, and we go off to the IGF and do good work, but ISPs are huddled off in other corners, and industry, which is impacted by this debate and needs to engage with government, is not monolithic. We need to find fora where we can come together in a more comprehensive way, in a more meaningful way, to engage government so that these storm clouds don't become outright hurricanes.
Commissioner, bringing you back from Wyoming here in your saddle
I'm off
days.
the sagebrush there for
That's
a second.
right. In fact, I should also give everybody a little warning that I'll be opening up for questions from the floor in just a moment. But you've now heard a series of comments about the role of government, the role of industry. I'd be interested to hear your views about where you see the leadership role of the FCC globally. What should the FCC be doing? It traditionally has done a lot of capacity building with governments around the world. It's been very successful in doing this. But from a policy perspective, what role do you think the FCC ought to be playing going forward internationally?
Well, the scary thing is, David, as I travel internationally in the capacity of my job, I realize that other countries really do watch what the FCC does, perhaps more than we watch it within our own borders, and that's a little scary sometimes. So other countries are learning from us and maybe emulating us, or maybe going further than that, or maybe doing something different. But whether we like to think of ourselves or not as thought leaders for the world, that's what the FCC can be at times. I think it's important for all of us to, well, first of all, the FCC could act as a facilitator, but not in lieu of the State Department or Department of Commerce or others, but to help lend some technical expertise, or at least talk about our successes and perhaps our failures as well. But I think overall, we need to be answering a fundamental question, which is what is the standard for government involvement in this space? What should be a global standard for a government to get involved in this space, whatever the issue might be, whether it's privacy or network issues or whatever the case might be. And if we can't start to define that, then governments around the globe, as they are doing now, will make up their own rules, all in the name of the public interest, according to the definition of public interest within that country. And China's definition of public interest is going to be a lot different from ours or others. So that discussion needs to be had. And I think, as you heard from this very distinguished intelligent panel here, there are a lot of complexities and there are a lot of concerns. I'll pick up on Brian's remark that it's really time for non-governmental entities. You said industry in particular, but I think you also might mean industry and NGOs, to come together and try to hammer out these things on their own. Go back to the original playbook that made the internet explode faster than any other disruptive technology in human history. I've said many times before that it is the greatest deregulatory success story of all time, precisely because of that model. You were mentioning some figures of sort of how long it took the wireline penetration to happen globally as compared to wireless, and then as compared to internet itself. And as you peel back the onion to analyze that, well, the more deregulated the industry was, the quicker it proliferated throughout the world, and has been improving the human condition more quickly than any other technology, I think, that has ever been created by human beings. So let's keep all that in mind. Let's figure out what made all that successful, and not get away from that, not get lost in a lot of these other very important issues, but that can become peripheral and distracting. So again, in your introductory remarks, you talked about who gets to regulate the internet, and that is so far removed from where we were 10 years ago, it's very unsettling to me.
Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that bearing the scars of 7 years of government experience prior to going into the private sector, I do think that it's well nigh impossible in this area to get a global government standard. All of the experience that we have dealing with governments proves that, I'm afraid. On the other hand, I do think that we can get different industry and NGO to come together, as has been suggested. Just to give one example of what we have done lately in Washington, we have brought together IT companies and companies from the financial sector, led by Citi, because we're all committed to lobbying on the free flow of information, particularly the question of location of data centers and fighting international attempts by governments to require that one's data centers be located in the country where you have services. So I do think that this kind of activity is possible, and the next step obviously is to broaden it and internationalize it and bring in the global companies.
If I could just also clarify for Bob, so that's precisely my point, which is that governments across the globe aren't going to be able to come together in agreement on what is the standard for global intervention. You're just not going to be able to, so it has to be left to industry and NGOs to do that, which was back to square one of how we started all this to begin with.
But I guess I would say that, and I agree, but I do think governments do have a role to play, and it depends on what the subject is. I mean, obviously, governments have a role to play in cybercrime and cybersecurity, and the idea of like cyber defense and how that all plays out. They also have a role to play when they decide not to play a role and to stepping back, and I think that's important too. And I do think, in concert with what's been described here, you need to work on building a consensus among the like-minded governments around what is the vision we're trying to achieve, which we've tried to set out in our strategy. And I think that's very much led by the economic aspects here, which means that industry really does have to play the leading role in not screwing up what we've accomplished so far in trying to fix the problems.
And that's why the OECD principles, to our mind, were such a terrific effort, and we hope that we can build upon that.
Iñaki, from your perspective, both wearing your Spanish hat from Europe, but also your responsibilities throughout the Americas, is the conversation we're having today, the comments made by the panel, is this consistent with what you hear internationally? Or when you're having these discussions about these issues internationally, do you hear other voices? Do you hear other concerns about the role of government versus the role of industry and the like?
Yeah, sure. It's one of the reasons that we have Telefonica not operating as a retail market here in the States, but we have an office open in Washington, understanding what is happening in the regulatory arena, not only for the FCC, even in the European Union, and everything happens in between the European Union and the FCC has an impact immediately in other countries like Latin America, where we are operating. In all the matters, security, cybersecurity, privacy, everything. We are listening everything what they are doing to try to understand what is happening between the two big blocks and try to apply as much as possible, as better as possible in the Latin American countries. In that sense, we have very best practice, like in Colombia, for example, the Vive Digital is the digital agenda for the global goals in ICT sector. Very, very complete with 4 different axes. And the other countries and the other states, they are promoting, for example, the national champions or something like that. We try to overlapping what other companies are doing in these fields. And sometimes we are leaving different positions in countries that we understand that we will have, for us, will be more easier that have a common position in most of the issues that we are discussing.
Very good. Let me open up for some questions from the floor. We have one back over here. Then we'll come up. We'll try to give equal into every geographic area of the room.
Thanks for a surprisingly free market panel. Thank you. The word out of Brussels seems to be increasing on every front, but certainly relative to speech is more regulation. Obviously, their concept of free speech is quite different than an American concept of free speech, but clearly Brussels is going in the direction of more intense Brussels-directed control on speech issues. So do you view that as the wave of the future, or is it something that a counterweight, whether U.S.-based or elsewhere, can stop and reverse? And how do you deal with that real basic disconnect between Europe and the U.S.?
Was there anyone in particular you wanted to direct that to, or?
I can actually offer one comment on that. I think that, again, we're in the business of monoliths. Brussels. I disagree that you can call it that, because I think if you look at the Dutch or the Swedes currently, you're talking, and the Brits to some extent, although we can't tell where cybersecurity and, if you'll excuse the expression, cyber freedom will cross with them. If you look at the Dutch and the Swedes, certainly, and the French before their president got involved, there was great support, and still is, among the Dutch and the Swedes for the internet freedom work that Secretary Clinton has been promoting. I would say that there's less support among other countries, but that it is by no means a lost cause or a monolithic opposition to these kinds of ideas. Of course, they have different cultural understanding. If you go over there and you speak about, in First Amendment terms, about freedom of speech and all of that, people shut their ears. They don't want to be addressed that way. They don't want Americans to speak to them as if our system and our principles are the right and the only. And that's obvious. But nonetheless, I think there is good hope that we're going to see, and there are two conferences this fall, the one that Chris mentioned and another one that the Dutch and the Swedes are putting on in October, that are directly related to these issues. So I'm not a pessimist yet.
I'd echo that and just say there's this is not a new development. For years and years, we don't talk about the First Amendment when we go and talk to Europe. We talk about internationally recognized human rights and what that means in the free speech context. But put the internet aside, these have been issues in terms of hate speech and other issues where Europe has a fundamentally different view than us. That doesn't mean we back away from our fundamental view of the First Amendment and what we think is really the view of free speech generally, even with some of the costs that might be involved where it's distasteful speech, but it's still free speech. But that's not really just an internet issue, that's just a cultural issue for some of Europe. But it doesn't mean, in my view, that you can't make a lot of progress in the core free speech area, which I think there's a lot of ways we can sway them, and I think I would agree with Bob, they're not monolithic in that sense.
Right?
Yeah, I'm not going to speak to it in the free speech context, but with respect to the internet governance question, there is concern in Brussels about the way that the new TLD approval process occurred in ICANN. And for those of you who don't know, haven't heard that ICANN approved the opening of a new round for top-level domains, and there was an arduous multi-year process. But within that process, there's a government advisory committee, and that government advisory committee interacts with the ICANN board in specific ways under the bylaws. And I know that there's concern in Brussels and with some other governments about how that process came and went. There was a parallel interaction between the GAC and the board that to some degree was two parties talking past each other. The importance there is particularly going to 2012, next year. Having Brussels and Washington together on these questions of internet governance is critical. I see Mike Gallagher in the audience, and David, you two were the happy WSIS warriors who had to manage some difficulties on that front, but successfully did so and preserved the status quo and helped us create the IGF, which is a great forum. But having Brussels, and Brussels supports the multi-stakeholder model, but the tension in the immediate moment is not well timed. It needs to be addressed.
We have a question. Was it Harold back over here? Had a question?
I can't resist going back to the question of market failure, because it's one of the, to my mind, one of the most argued about terms, and one of the, I have often said, least defined terms in terms of the question of where do you regulate and where does government intervene. While this is to some degree obviously directed to Commissioner McDowell, but likewise directed to, I guess, anybody on the board would like to, how are we going to define market failure? And by that I mean there are a number of definitions that are out there. Some of them are economic, some of them are more socially oriented. And I would be curious if we're going to use market failure as the line for where government ought to step in. How do you define that in a way that will be consistent across all regulatory fora?
Well, excellent question. And as Chris and Bob were bringing up earlier, rather Bob, I guess, brought it up first, is it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to get international consensus on that on any broad scale. And that was part of my point of trying to go back to the beginning of the flow chart from several years ago, over a decade ago, to have as much facilitation by government for the private sector and NGOs, et cetera, to address many of these issues. So it depends on what context, what part of the internet ecosystem, if you will, we're talking about. But it's going to be fact specific, not to sound too much like a recovering lawyer myself, but it's going to be fact specific. It'll depend. Is it de minimis or is it pervasive? How are consumers harmed? Are they harmed to begin with, and how are they harmed? And how is it curable through existing law? Is it consumer protection law? Is it antitrust law? Is it curable? What does it take to cure it if there is market failure? All those are very relevant questions, but I think they all have to be asked and answered before we start with ex-ante regulation when we don't know the effects. There's market failure and there's regulatory failure. And regulatory failure doesn't get enough discussion, I don't think. So what is not happening and what harms are being caused by regulations that might have been imposed in the absence of evidence of palpable market failure? So excellent questions, and you and I will grow old and finally die. None of these questions will ever be answered.
Let's hope the death happens too quickly here. Anybody else? Next question. Ed?
Hi. A lot of great comments. And the Commissioner, I think, made a particularly good point that we shouldn't expect governments to actually willingly embrace policies that restrict their own activity that easily. The temptation for governments is to control, is to try to have more influence. They have legitimate policy goals. They see the internet as a somewhat of a Wild West that needs taming. But what also came out of a number of the comments is that all of the disjointed efforts, and we've got different organizations, we've got companies, we've got NGOs that are not coordinating. Okay, it seems to me the one thing to maybe take away from this is for all of the players who care in this, for whom it's not always the highest priority for everybody, but the amount of private sector coordination just has to increase. And the idea of coming up with some broad general guidelines, some presumptions of not interference, et cetera, some kind of principles out there that could get a lot of private sector support. So, and then frankly, be more united in pushing back across the board into the government space and saying, forbearance, restraint. The internet has been a tremendous tool for innovation, for economic growth, as well as for the social, political, cultural aspects. And pushing back in a more unified across-the-board way maybe has a chance to stop what I think is a very bad slide to ever increasing control, regulation, and limiting of internet freedom. And just,
Brian, did you want to?
I just want to note, I thought that was a very good summation from where I sit of the discussion points and what my thinking is. And I also want to point out, I think with respect to the U.S. strategy on cybersecurity, what really got my head nodding, Chris, was this point about the U.S. standing firm in the conviction that when international community meets to discuss the range of internet governance issues, these conversations must take place in a multi-stakeholder manner. Big point. So civil society, industry, and government coming together.
And I'll also tell you, without talking about particular countries, that one of the things we've been doing, particularly as countries look at their approaches to the internet and also companies and standards and supply chain, a lot of other issues, is to tell them to engage with their industry, to engage with the NGOs and the industry in their countries. And although the US has a long history of doing that, many countries don't. So that's a core part of the policy we're trying to carry forward. And when those things happen, sometimes they change their mind.
The question part of it was a comment. The question is, okay, how do we connect these folks? Can government play a stimulative role as a catalyst to help trying to encourage a lot of stakeholders to, in fact, start talking together, working together, maybe convening conferences, whatever, to get us to take the lead, and play the stimulus catalytic role, not necessarily the dominant leadership policy role?
I mean, I think yes, and I think that's what we're doing, frankly. I think, as I said, since I've been in this new job now for about 4 months, one of the first things I did was start meeting with a number of different industry groups, because again, they're not monolithic. I know when I was at the White House, that's precisely what we were doing too. I know Danny does a lot of that at OSTP. I mean, these are discussions where we really have to move forward, having all those stakeholders involved. When we developed the international strategy, we briefed it to industry groups, we briefed it to NGOs and the privacy community. I think that's kind of core to our approach. How we do that, because again, trying to bring all of industry into a room is kind of an unrealistic sense, but really having a good way to plug in and knowing that there are focuses in the government, at both at the White House, at the State Department of Commerce and other places, and at the FCC certainly, and the FTC are important to know, and those have to continue.
Go back.
Maybe bring it just a little bit closer to home under the theory that all politics is local. Curiously and interestingly, just a few days ago in San Francisco, the BART had shut down internet service in the public transportation system there. Without going into the merits or demerits of that specific decision by the public safety agency, I was wondering, in the context of this broader global discussion about internet freedom and framework for regulatory environments, what is, in your perspectives, the proper role, if any, for our agencies of government at the federal level, potentially at the FCC, Congress, or other agencies, to look at this specific instance and draw either conclusions or other determinations about what happened there?
Ryan, you look like you want to take that softball.
Yeah, I think it's happening. I've been in the domain name industry since 2002, and I remember, and our dirty little secret, by the way, is domain names are really boring. Talking to people outside of this type of group, I talk to my family or friends, use the phrase domain names and people glaze over. But, not so long ago, to a certain degree, that was how it was on the policy at the agency level, at the administration level years ago. But you can track very concretely the rise of this issue and the internet and domain name system up the scale of priorities at the administration. I think to a large degree it's getting the type of attention and emphasis it deserves.
Chris, did you want to comment about that, since it sounded like it was in your bailiwick as well?
No, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think all of these issues have a much higher priority now than I've been doing this stuff for about 20 years, and I will tell you that actually discussions about how all these things interrelate haven't happened to the degree they're happening now, and they haven't happened at the level that they're happening now. You would not go to deputies meetings before where all the deputies actually understood this at a very deep level, so that's, I think, a real advance.
Okay, back over here.
Thank you, Nigel Cameron, Centre for Policy on Emerging Technologies. In the title of this session, there is a reference to Wikileaks, which I have not gathered was been a sort of major focus of interest. It's maybe because Wikileaks was hotter back when the program was put together. But I would be very interested in some comments on the whole question, because, I mean, 21st century is all about asymmetry, it seems to me, in the wider security and strategic context. And Julian Assange understands that, probably better than anybody else. And it would be interesting to have some comment. Thank you.
All right. Okay, WikiLeaks. Brian, you look like you're just chomping at the bit for that one.
Yeah, I'm not trying to dodge it, but I approach the discussion and I look at WikiLeaks as just one event. I don't put a lot of qualitative emphasis on it in terms of talking points today. But it's one event that's going to repeat itself somewhere, somehow on the internet some information is going to come out that some government doesn't want out. And whether there is a criminal violation underlying it or it's just embarrassing content, it's going to happen again and again. And so the importance of WikiLeaks to me is more in that global setting. How do we coordinate? How do we, from an industry and NGO and civil society perspective, educate governments that when they try to stop bad things from happening on the internet, they can do it in ways that can break the system, that can harm the operation of the DNS. And again, that standards-based protocol is the secret sauce to our future. So that's how I view WikiLeaks.
Bob?
I was trying to.
No.
We're not allowed to comment about WikiLeaks in our spirit of transparency. I will, however, make some personal comments about this because I do think it's a critical issue. I'd agree that it's not the first or the last time we're going to see it happen. As a former national security type, I don't understand how government officials are going to be able to conduct business in the future, everyday business. And I was rather impressed, by the way, by the cables that I read, by the straightforward nature of some of them, and by the insights that our people overseas are providing. So I thought that was kind of cool, actually. The second thing that I would say about WikiLeaks, and again, personal opinion, I just think it's too damn bad that an interesting cause like this is embodied in the personage of Julian Assange. I think that he is a far too, shall we say, self-interested and self-oriented a person to be, to put the best face forward on the issue of government transparency. And government transparency is incredibly important.
Well, I think seeing Tom lurking over my shoulder here, it's a signal that it's lunchtime. So let me ask you to thank this panel for solving all of the world's problems so quickly.
Well, let me